Year 11, and welcome to our third lesson of our online learning. Well done for your attendance yesterday in the Google Meet. Today it'll be a pre-recorded one, but we'll go back to the Google Meet next Thursday. So yesterday, obviously, we did crime and punishment retrieval. So again, today we're going to focus on that Germany retrieval. We want to really embed that Germany knowledge. We know that as a class, we've got really fantastic Germany knowledge, and we want to keep that going. So the questions today are: what does the NSDAP stand for? Who did Hitler succeed as the leader of the party? So who was the initial leader of the Nazi party? What is a manifesto? Who were the Freikorps? What is censorship? Which treaty did Hitler want to get rid of? What does nationalize mean? What other name is given to the Munich putsch? What was the immediate outcome of the putsch? So what happened just after the Munich putsch? So remember, the Munich putsch was in 1923. Which crime was Hitler charged with following the Munich putsch? What was Mein Kampf all about? So the book he wrote while he was in prison. How long did Hitler serve in Landsberg prison? What happened to the Nazi party following the Munich putsch? What is propaganda? What did the US recall following the Wall Street crash? So what did they want back after the Wall Street crash of 1929? Which other political party was also gaining large levels of support in Germany during the Depression? So the Nazis, obviously, we know were doing really well after the Depression, but there was another political party that were doing just as well. What is a scapegoat? List two things that Hitler did to gain support during the period 1929 to 1932, and I think you guys have learned that with plugs. How many people were unemployed by 1932 in Germany? And which two men held the position of Chancellor immediately prior to Hitler? So just before Hitler becomes Chancellor in 1933. Okay, so I'll give you some time. Obviously, it's pre-recorded today, so you take as much time as you need to it and then come back to go through the answers. Now you're completing that first section of the Google form. Obviously, don't submit it all until you've finished all the different 4 sections. So if just go through the answers. So number 1 was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. A guy called Anton Drexler. He was the first leader of the Nazi party. A manifesto is a set of rules. So the Nazi party had 25-point program, so a set of rules that they were going to follow. Who were the Freikorps? They were the ex-army soldiers. So remember, the army was reduced quite significantly, wasn't it, after the First World War? What is censorship? It's when you try and control views. Which treaty did Hitler want to get rid of? He obviously wants to scrap the Treaty of Versailles, and it was because of that that he got such large support, because a lot of Germans hated the Treaty of Versailles. Nationalise means it's controlled by the state or controlled by the government. So if you try and nationalise something, the government controls it all. What other name is given to the Munich putsch? It's the beer hall putsch. Immediate outcome of the putsch was that Hitler is arrested, and obviously he's put on trial. Which crime is he charged of? Treason. He's trying to take over the government, and he's trying to take over the Bavarian government in this case. What was Mein Kampf all about? So is Hitler's political views and kind of ramblings about things. It's very incoherent as a book. He serves 9 months. He was actually sentenced, wasn't he, to 5 years, but he only serves 9 months. So they were very, very lenient on him. What happened to the Nazi party following the Munich putsch is they struggled to gain support. Remember, we call this the lean years between 1924 and 1929 for the Nazi party. Propaganda is when you try and persuade somebody of an idea. The US recalled the Dawes Plan, or certainly the loans involved with the Dawes Plan, after the Wall Street crash. So that destroyed Germany's economy. The communists are also doing very, very well at the time that the Nazis are. Scapegoat is when you blame somebody for a problem. So remember, Hitler tries to blame other people for the problems in Germany. Blames Weimar, blames Jews, blames lots of other groups. 2 things he did, so his speeches and his policies. He wants to scrap the Treaty of Versailles. People liked his ideas. He promises them work, bread. And remember, at this point in 1932, there's 6.2 million Germans unemployed. And the 2 chancellors just before Hitler were a guy called von Papen and von Schleicher. Okay, well done. Now I'm just going to reflect on some of the work that we did yesterday. So we looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis yesterday, and I just want to delve into that in a little bit more depth. So we know that the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 was the closest the world had ever come to nuclear war. So after 1962, it put both sides, gave them a bit of a warning shot, really, that actually things were getting out of hand and things were getting very close to nuclear war. So there were two main consequences, really, of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The first is that they set up a hotline, so a phone line between Moscow, so between Khrushchev and the White House and Kennedy. And that was to stop any miscommunication. So all these letters going back and forth during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was lots of chance of misunderstanding. So actually they set up this hotline between the two so they could directly communicate with each other. And the other was the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And what they did is they both agreed that they were not going to test nuclear weapons above ground. So they would still allow them below ground, but they were not going to test them above ground anywhere, because that would act as a kind of warning shot. So two things to try and cool down the situation. So what you need to do now is just complete the second section of the Google form. So there's just two questions on the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, what were the consequences? We know that the whole of the Cold War is about one thing happening, something happening as a consequence. So we're just going to now review the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So remember yesterday I talked you through the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I just want to go over it one more time just to make sure that it is consolidated. So we start off with the fact that Castro, this guy in the left-hand corner, he takes over Cuba, and he is a communist and he is supported by the USSR. And what it turns out the USSR had been doing is putting nuclear weapons missiles into Cuba, because they felt it would protect Cuba and protect them from the Americans. Now the Americans, with their spy plane, their big U-2 spy planes, they discover these nuclear weapons, and they tell Kennedy that there are nuclear weapons in Cuba. And obviously Kennedy's very worried about this. The USSR don't know, and Cuba don't know yet the Americans have found out. So Kennedy's got some decisions to make. He could either launch an attack on Cuba, but that could lead to all-out war, or he could look for diplomacy, or he could order a naval blockade. And what he decides to do is order this kind of naval blockade, so these ships, to stop more ships coming across and bringing more weapons. Remember, the weapons aren't fully operational yet. So what then happens is Kennedy goes on TV, he states very clearly that the Americans will take a strong stance against the USSR, and that the USSR need to remove those weapons from Cuba. There are then a series of letters that go back and forth between kind of Khrushchev and Kennedy, and Kennedy's taking a strong stance and Khrushchev is taking a strong stance as well. And tensions are really high. Remember, this is the closest the world has ever got to nuclear war. So tensions are very high. Now, it finally resolves itself with a couple of faxes. So Khrushchev basically sends a fax and says that, look, we will remove our weapons in Cuba as long as you promise to not attack Cuba effectively. They then sent a second fax, but Kennedy just ignores the second fax because it was a bizarre fax. So Kennedy eventually accepts this, and what they also do is they make this deal that in 6 months' time, America is going to withdraw its weapons from Turkey as well. So, but that was kept secret as part of the deal. So eventually what happens is that Khrushchev removes the weapons from Cuba. It's seen as an act of weakness really from Khrushchev, and it's seen as very much that Kennedy has won the situation by acting in a way that has stopped the world from going to war. Now Kennedy, remember, was under a lot of pressure from his army chiefs to strike Cuba, to be seen as strong, but actually he felt it was better to try and come up with this kind of diplomatic solution. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is I would like you just to write a short summary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So just a short paragraph about what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So remember, we've got the U-2 spy planes discovering the nuclear weapons. We've got Kennedy deciding that he's going to do a naval blockade. We've got Kennedy going on TV and stating very clearly the Americans will take a strong stance against the USSR. We've got a series of letters, threatening letters to each other. We've got the situation where they are very close to nuclear war. And then finally, we've got these faxes that are sent saying that they will withdraw their weapons if the Americans promise not to attack Cuba. And then 6 months down the line, America promised they're going to withdraw their weapons from Turkey. Okay, good luck. Go to section 3 of the Google form. So I just want you to write a paragraph. It doesn't need to be a long paragraph, just about the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what happened during these 13 days? Now, the last thing we're going to do today is we're just going to keep reviewing some of the areas we need to work on from that kind of internal exam we had just before Christmas. And today we're going to focus on Germany. Now, this was probably the weakest of questions from the class in general. And this, remember, is this last question. So it's a big question. It's worth a lot of marks, and it can have quite a significant impact on your grade. So doing well in this question can bump you up quite easily into the next grade boundary. So how far do you agree with interpretation 1 about the reasons for Hitler being appointed Chancellor? Now, what happened during the internal exam is a lot of you who have got fantastic subject knowledge gave me 2 strong kind of for and against arguments and a conclusion, but really didn't analyse the actual interpretation. So we're going to work today a little bit on structure, and I just want you to attempt one side of the argument. Okay, so here we've got the interpretation. So it says, to many Germans, it seemed that the Weimar government was making a hopeless mess of handling the situation. Some people who had never bothered to vote in elections before because of a lack of interest in politics were now wanting to become more involved. From right and left, they could hear the claims of the extremist parties who said they could solve all the problems. The communists said that the Depression showed that the capitalist system was doomed. The Nazis blamed the Weimar Republic, the Treaty of Versailles, and promised to get rid of the enemy within who was destroying Germany. So that's the interpretation. Remember, obviously in the exam you've got 2 interpretations, so you'll have another one as well. We're just going to focus on one today and perfect that one though. So if we look at the criterion, we'll start with A to D. So what we've got to do is we've got to have stated the main argument of the interpretation. We've got to use examples from the interpretation. That's the really crucial bit. We've got to state whether we agree with the claim, and then we've got to support that with our own knowledge. So we've got to do those kind of 4 things for the first bit, and then we'll repeat 3 of those bits again. So what we've got to do is you've got to state what the main argument is. We've got to use example from the interpretation, state whether we agree, support it with our own knowledge. So we've got to follow those 4 steps in that first bit. So, and we'll do that 3 times. So let's see this in action. So you've got here, first thing I'll do is what the main argument of the interpretation is. So I've said interpretation 1 states the main reason for Hitler being appointed Chancellor was the failure of the Weimar and the turn to extremist parties. So that's what that interpretation is claiming. Now I've got to use an example from the interpretation. So I've got to use a quote. So it says, for example, it states that people were listening to the claims of the extremist parties. Now I've got to say whether I agree with this claim. Now, I already know, don't I, that obviously the communists and the Nazis are both doing quite well after the Wall Street crash. So I think that's a relatively strong claim. So I've said this is a strong claim because following the Wall Street crash and the onset of the Depression, the extremist parties did appear to offer a way out for the German people. And then I've got to support this with my own knowledge. So I'll say, as a result, votes for both the communists and the Nazis increased, and they secured more seats in the Reichstag. So I use my own knowledge to support that. So I've done those things. So I'm feeling pretty confident about the start of my first paragraph. So I've done this first strip, haven't I, in that. So I've said what the main argument is, I've used an example, stated whether I agreed with it, and I've supported with my knowledge. Now, because I've already said what the main argument is, I don't need to repeat that first top bit. But what I do need to do is use another example from the interpretation, state whether I agree with it, support with my knowledge, and then again, third example, state whether I agree, support with my own knowledge. So it should be relatively easy to do. Here's the second bit. Remember, I don't need to put the main argument again, but I do need to use another bit of information from the interpretation, which is what a lot of you didn't do. So it says, furthermore, the interpretation states that Weimar was making a hopeless mess of handling the situation. Remember, again, I'm stating whether I agree. So this claim is certainly supported by the fact that Weimar had failed completely to deal with the huge levels of unemployment. Then I'm going to back that up with my own knowledge. So I know that by 1932, unemployment had reached 6 million or 6.2 million, I could have put, and that the coalition governments led by Brüning, von Schleicher and von Papen had shown how ineffectual coalition governments were at this time. I think at this point, you're probably ready to write this paragraph. So remember, we're just doing the four-side of the argument. So I just want you to write the interpretation, the analysis of interpretation one, and this is interpretation one. So you can use the two bits I've done and then just find another bit from the source, another quote from the source or interpretation, sorry, that we haven't looked at so far. So there's plenty in there. You could talk about the Treaty of Versailles, for example, or the enemy within. So lots to talk about. So you've got two choices now. You either have a go at that fourth section, you think you're ready for that fourth section, or you can carry on the video and there's a bit more support if you want a little bit more support. So you can see here, I've just broken it down a little bit more. So obviously I've done that main bit, the interpretation states that, I've given the example, I said that it's a strong claim, I've used my own knowledge. Now I've done that again and again and again. Remember, you don't have to do the main argument. So I'm going to leave this up. If you're struggling, obviously I'll just leave this up. You can pause this video and obviously use this to help you out as well. So ultimately your answer should look something like this. This is what we're trying to aim for. Well done today. Excellent as always. Remember, you can go back through the video and pause bits and work on bits that you need to at your own pace with this one. But like I said, we'll come back to that live lesson next Thursday. Just remember as well that you need to submit the form. So make sure you submit the form. Every Monday I'm going to give you guys feedback, but I can't do that if you haven't submitted the form properly.